I'm so excited to welcome back Tamara Kwe. Tamara is going to be talking about strengthening our work with First Nations youth. Tamara is an award-winning storyteller and advocate. Her life work is in social justice for Indigenous peoples, building pathways to learning for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous audiences, and being a catalyst for change. She's done a lot of work on anti-violence strategies and education frameworks, work around human trafficking and public education. Her work focuses on strength-based approaches on Indigenous gendered pedagogy, storytelling, and story sharing. She has 2 TED Talks. Her TED Talks focus on higher education as acts of social justice, and her lifetime dedication and commitment to spark hope and encourage change. So welcome back, and I want to thank you for being here again.
Miigwech, thank you so much for that introduction. I am so happy to be here again with all of you. Courtney, Sky, it's nice to always see a familiar face. I see a few familiar faces here today. And I just wanted to say miigwech for all of you guys. This week has been phenomenal. I've been able to tap in and out and listen to some of the other speakers and workshops. And so it's been truly an honor to be part of this. And I just wanted to say miigwech to Nancy and Barbara again for organizing this for the Ontario Chiefs Women's Initiative. I like to start this off with a music video that I did not create, but I like to share this video because I feel like it sets the tones. It reminds us why we do the work we do. And it also brings me back to remember when I was young. So this is from Lar First Nation. These young Indigenous youth actually wrote this song, was able to get funds, make a home studio. And there's a link in my slideshow where you could actually download their music in iTunes as well and learn more about this project that was very empowering and healing for them. So here we go. I also find that video very powerful and it resonates with so many of our youth. I highly encourage you guys to take a look at these amazing and powerful artists because their stories echo across our country that many youth are facing these days. And it's something that I felt that I've learned in my work supporting youth, that sometimes these songs help them express themselves when they can't find the words, because far too often they have been forced to be silent or made to believe that their truth isn't worth to be expressed or heard. I found sometimes listening to these empowering Indigenous youth who came together and shared their experiences and stories and sharing their healing journey and reclaiming themselves, sometimes ignited and sparked expressions, hope, love, self-worth, and aspirations. And so this is a little tool in my bundle to help others that I use, and I wanted to share with you guys today. So bonjour, for those who I never got to meet earlier this week, my English name is Tamara Bernard, but my spirit name is Wasayizig Megase Ekwe, Makwadodem, Ne Akasha Zingi Nishnabek. So I am Shining Eagle Woman. I am from Galt Bay First Nation, which is just located up top of Lake Superior, located up top of Lake Nipigon off of Lake Superior. I am a small town Northern Ontario girl. I am so honored to be where I am in my life. It has not come easy. I myself was a youth that struggled a lot with my self-worth, self-love, due to the nature from even my previous conversation, talking about how at the age of 13, me and my birth mom got separated. I was temporary in the system until my dad was able to take me, but there were still wounds from things that I endured while with my mom. And so when we talk about life course and learning in honoring ourselves, how intrinsically that is to come to know who we are and our self-worth and our identity is tied to the land. And so what led me to this work? Besides being a youth myself, and sometimes when I found, and I've been working with youth in all over Ontario, but I did start in Southern Ontario when I was there for about 11 years. And I was in different capacities, from frontline outreach to youth women's circles to post-secondary spaces as a support within our First Nation Student Lounge to the Indigenous services. And then I became an education resource counselor and a teacher. And so all these different hats that I wore in all these different roles and regions province-wide gave me the opportunity to not learn about myself more and reflect on my youth, but how that similar experiences and similar questions of self arose with youth today and continues to happen. And so I think that we need to give ourselves a pat on the back because we are here today to recognize that strengthening Indigenous trauma-informed work for our youth is reclaiming our ways of being, our natural ways of being, how we did praise and strengthen one another within our communities before colonialism disrupted our social system. Our negative energies and interactions and stereotypes and lateral violence did not exist before. And far too often, our youth are targets of a lot of violence, especially if they're female youth. So what does this mean and what does this look like moving forward? So from my experience working, a lot of the youth always gravitated to wanting to learn more about their culture and what that meant for them. And every youth has an individual pursuit. And I really like to emphasize that. So when we talk about living the good life, Mino na Bazawin is very individualistic because that pathway to the good life is going to be different for every youth that we're working with. And it's important for them to feel in control. We may be the vehicle. We may be the driver of that vehicle, right? We're providing the car and we may be driving, but they're giving us directions. And while they're giving us directions, we're helping them build relationships and connections to tools and resources and supports along the way. And it's important that when we are on this journey, walking with them, that to encourage not to compare because everybody's journey is different and it's not linear. Who is holding the measuring stick? And that's a westernized concept of healing, that we need to have these reality objectives, these end goals. And this is my time frame for you. Because after that, it expires. But in our Anishinaabe worldview, it never expires. We're lifelong learners. And part of that lifelong learning is lifelong healing now. So we need to embody that and recognize that. And in some cases, our youth may feel empowered to change their lifestyle, their current situations and realities. So when we talk about a journey of balance in the good life, it's a process of restoring our 4 directions of being. And that's in our heart, body, mind, and spirit. That's relearning, remembering, and activating that light that we all have. And sometimes it is us telling youth, we see that light. I see that good in you. Sometimes it may be the first time they've ever been told that. And just that one sentence, I see that light in you, shifts their whole narrative of how they see themselves. And it sparks the beginning of that pathway towards the good life. Why the good life, right? And so I do get asked this question often. So now that, although I wore these multiple hats in Tamara Kwe, I do come in across our province, sometimes doing consulting, reviewing their data intake for youth that they're supporting through their programs and services or outreach. And I always bring it back to our teachings. Because if we focus in our services, in our practice as a helper, and we're not balanced within our own 4 directions of self, our data, our services, and our support and programs won't be balanced either. How we are to encourage that balance with our youth if we're not practicing it ourselves or delivering the programs or supports in that way either. So I'm famously known to walk in with if they don't have a whiteboard, my big chart paper, my smelly markers. I love smelly markers. I think they just make work more fun. And I draw out the medicine wheel and I start talking, okay, talk about our 4 directions of our being. Where does your program support heart, body, mind, spirit? Because believe it or not, that is part of dismantling colonial violence within ourselves as a helper, within our programs and services, and that ripple effects the colonial violence and ideas and portrayals that our youth may believe as well. It's a big ripple effect. And far often, if you look even at social work theories, so we look at Baskin and Linklater or Hart, they turn to Mina Dabas from the good life and what that means. So our original teachings, like I mentioned before, were truly the ways of being. That harmony, that peace, that respect, equality, that balance. We are here today to shift to bring that restoration and encourage our helpers in strength-based practices. And I like to call that an extension of kindness. An extension of kindness as if they were your family member, your cousin, your auntie, your nephew, your niece, or even a kid or youth that you adopted into your home. That extension of kindness, of care. Because it helps us to learn and recognize that far too often what Westernized theories, our program evaluations or structures do not align with our ways of being. And actually, it may be more oppressive and more harmful then. So I'm here to say, well, okay, government may be saying this, or funding agency may be saying that for your project to be successful. Well, let's draw out the medicine wheel together and let's make it work within fitting our circle within their box. Because it's time for them to recognize that we are adaptable and we are resilient and we are going to be here for forever, right? And part of that is dismantling the system from within. And I like to provide tools from my bundle to help everybody here today with that. We are creative, addressing contemporary barriers that are happening within our youth and our families and communities, right? It is vital for us to use our traditional knowledge and practices and approaches to empower and to support that type of healing. But where does that all begin? Because I've always been taught, and I had to learn the hard way early in my career, you can only take those that you are helping as far as you have come. How far you've come, you cannot give what you do not have. Yes, people can only meet you as much as you met yourself. Yes, you can only share the knowledge you have. Yes, excellent. Miigwech, you guys. That's exactly it, because how are you to walk alongside as a helper if you haven't done the work yourself? So it really truly does start with our own relations. So that's all our relations, or also known as all my relations. And a lot of the time when people think of that, they think of my relationships to my auntie, to my nokomis, to my mishomis, to the land. And I always say, we got to dig deeper. What is your relationship with yourself in your four directions? Your heart, your body, your mind, and your spirit. Are they all four balanced, right? When we are balanced, we're able to maintain that grounding. We don't have, and like I may have mentioned before, I don't like using the word trigger. And I said, well, let's encourage you to use a strong human response, because far too often when we use the word trigger, it has a negative tie to it. Oh, she's triggered, or he's triggered, or this is triggering them that we need to de-escalate. But even though we're de-escalating, we're having a strong human response, and that's not a bad thing. We're listening to our body, heart, mind, and spirit, recognizing I still have work to do, and that is okay, right? We're not going to call each other out on that. We're going to support and walk together on that. And that is about supporting each other's, filling each other's copper cups in our four directions, maintaining that equilibrium, and not judging, not pointing it out. If anything, supporting and protecting if needed, if you learn to recognize what an environment or people or things may evoke a strong human response. And if you see it coming before your person that you have extended kindness to, extended care to, you can help reduce strong human response, right? Some say it would be a strong spiritual response, depending on what it was. If it's something that our spirit within us remembered from a previous life. And sometimes we need to talk it out to figure out why am I having this response? I don't understand, right? Well, for us to have that connection and understanding, we need to have those relationships within ourselves. And it's taken me a lot of trial and error to learn that. And I'm still learning sometimes, because I do sometimes overwork. And it's about being kind to yourself, that it is okay to not be okay. And in fact, I also am, like I said, I'm still a teacher. I'm a professor part-time. There was a class last semester I said to my students for my Indigenous education, I said, I can't teach today. It's been a heavy day. talking about the little bodies that were recovered from the previous residential school sites. And I said, I'm not okay. And so I'm taking my day to do self-care, and I encourage my students to do the same. Role modeling, self-care is vital for our youth, and letting them know when they are not okay, that it's okay for them to be okay, and that they're not alone, that we've been there before. So all of our relations deeply connects to our pathways towards the good life. So when we're walking together for trauma informed, this is the medicine wheel. So you already gave it away, how I work my mind. So when I thought of spirit, it talks about our relations right away. Those relationships, right? We're starting with spirit. And as we walk around the medicine wheel to the mind, as we learn about our relationships, we're going to learn things that we need to unlearn, let go. We're decolonizing ourselves as a helper. And through that process, you will then support the decolonization of what youth believe. That ego that's telling them horrible things to believe in, their lie. Does anybody know what I mean when I say your lie that you believe? A lie is something that we tell ourselves because somewhere along the road, since we came in from the spirit to the physical world, an interaction in our life made us believe it. My lie for the majority of my life was I was not worthy to be loved. And I carried it. And it informed my decisions, which then influenced my behaviors, which were very self-destructive and unhealthy. Some of us haven't ever knew we carried a lie until we learned our relationships within ourselves in that 4 directions. That's the first step as a helper, to understand our relations. And then through that, we can support our youth to understand their relations within themselves to uncover their lie. That's part of the decolonization work. Then we move into the body, that gender-informed approach, gender-informed understanding, because based on our gender and sexuality, we all have different experiences of discrimination, racism, violence, oppression. And it is our job to release that oppression and violence from our body. We started decolonizing our mind. We're starting to organize and catalog things here to shove that lie out or lies out, because we're building a new way of living and being. We're living the good life. We're building our pathways. We're trailblazing, right? We're walking with them. We may be holding off back branches so they don't go in the face. If you know what I'm talking about when you walk in the bush. That's the works. And when we're doing that, we're releasing that negative, that trauma we carry. And for women, a lot of women carry trauma in the hips. So that's why when you do pigeon poses, like hip openers or needle and thread, they're called needle and thread and pigeon, there is a emotional release for some women. So when we learn through that, we're understanding the lived experiences that's being gendered informed. We can connect it to how structurally and systematic why you experience this. And it's not your fault. It's a system's fault. And our youth need to really, I found when we go around the medicine wheel and they start learning that and they realize it's not my fault. My life is, I am here today, not by choice. I aged out of care, was in the justice system, not because I wanted to. It was not my choice, but because of our system. And again, so when you think, when we started at spirit, my relations, I see the light in you. And I said that first shift happens, we're into the body when we start saying, it's not your fault. It was not your choice. Another shift happens. You see the load that they've been carrying starting to come off. When we get to the heart, that extended of kindness, you start to understand how we are combating these barriers and challenges together. And while we're doing that, there's healing, sharing, knowledge creation together, stories. This is when we become truly trauma informed. we have to walk all the way around the medicine wheel together. And it may not be that easy. You might have to go back from, you might go spirit, mind, you start going to body. I got to go back to mind. There's things that are coming up for me when I'm trying to understand the systems and structures and how those differ by gender and sexuality. But some of my ideas that have been ingrained are popping up. It's not aligning with what the youth is telling me of their lived experience, and my judgment is popping up. I got to go back to mind. And we talked about that, right? We talked about earlier how this is not a linear journey. It's going to be all over the place. If I could use a marker, I'll be like, it'd be like a swiggle mark all over the place. And that is excellent. That is great. You want it that way. That's when the learning happens. And you're role modeling your learning and mistakes with the youth. Sometimes a smile is a perfect lie. Very true. First responsibility to ourselves. This is the portrait of Indigenous youth right now in Canada. It's important to recognize that Indigenous youth are one of the largest populations in our country, and they're actually continuing to grow. So Research Statistics Canada has projected that by 2041, that Indigenous population in Canada could reach between 2.5 and 3.2 million persons. While the Indigenous population is projected to age at a faster rate than non-Indigenous population, it is expected that our population will remain younger and that the youth will make up a larger share of the populations coming forward. That's very important information for us to know. It's also very important to learn and understand, which I'm sure all of you guys already know, that more often than not, a lot of our youth are parents. And for the most part, they are single parents, and the representation of single parents are young women. And so when we think about challenges, barriers, it's important for our youth to feel when they share their experiences or why they couldn't make an appointment or why they're struggling to continue a program that you may be employing is because there's barriers, especially if they're a single young parent. And then on top of that, because they are a young Indigenous person, more often than not, they experience heightened risks of violence. For them to go and get their groceries sometimes can be one of the largest battles because of the various forms of violence that they can counter. So when we think about that, does it surprise us that sometimes when we hear our young Indigenous people say, what's the point? What's the point? Does it really matter? That's when we recognize that their four directions of being are not balanced, that they're not being reminded of their light within themselves, right? How do we move forward when there's such complexities within our province for our youth? And I say that in a way to be mindful when I think about where I'm geographically located right now is Thunder Bay, Ontario. A vast majority of the representation of youth here are from communities outside of Thunder Bay, especially the flyout. So there's this overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in care out of their own home, out of their own communities. There's an overrepresentation of them aging out of care, overrepresentation of the criminal justice, and to be sexually exploited. Because far too often, violence, homelessness, and sexual violence is a human condition that is described about our Indigenous youth. That is a problem, and it continues to be a problem across our country, not just in our province alone. And that is due to, obviously, the impacts of colonialism, intergenerational trauma, forced displacement. We have to remember that when they age out of care, for the most part, there is not something set up for them to go. They're displaced again. And for the most part, those youth have been from home, then from group home to group home, and then at the most vulnerable, homeless. Displaced, being displaced, being displaced. The overrepresentation of this is the homelessness, the poverty, the precarious employment, victimization, sexual and physical abuse. So the rates of Indigenous youth in care and justice system reflect a huge social structural issue. There's barriers. It's creating what's also known as the crossover youth into the criminal justice system. When we say that the crossover, they're still involved in child welfare or readying to transition out of care, a lot of research is saying that the child welfare has become a pipeline for youth to end up in the criminal justice system. And it means that many times for survival for our youth is to engage in strategic strategies such as theft, conning, trading sex for basic needs like shelter, food, money, drugs. So when we think about understanding that behavior of crossover youth, there's not a lot of research. It's a phenomenon, a crisis that's happening in our province that needs a lot more focus on, attention to. When I say that, to not only understand their experiences, but then to develop solutions that is informed and reformed from our youth themselves. And why does this matter? It matters because far too often, when I was sharing earlier, these labels, identities, are categories or misrepresentations and stereotypes that are placed on our youth, they carry. Did you know our body is made up of 75 to 82% of water, and that water is living? So when we think about the study from Dr. Emoto, and he said positive words like I love you, you're beautiful, thank you, the water physiology changed to crystals, beautiful crystals as you see. But when you're said I'll kill you, you're ugly, you're worthless, go die, they didn't crystallize. So if we're carrying that energy, our body, that water in our body, we need to remember then if they have something that evokes a strong human response on top of what they're carrying, the mental health of our youth is a crisis right now. It really is. Even if, and it was mentioned earlier, the smile, I may have a smile on my face, but my physiology is not developing crystals in the water. And then one thing that may evoke a strong human response, and us as helpers in the field, if we may be with them, we go, what just happened? And we want to say we're de-escalating and we're trying to get them to understand that you're overreacting, but they don't realize where their physiology is. Can we ever truly understand the baseline of our Indigenous youth if there's a continuum? These are things we need to remember as helpers and service providers, right? And that the lack of eye contact, lack of confidence, lack of communication is not them being rude. It's something that they've been taught. Your voice is not worthy. So if I'm not worthy, then why am I going to look at you when I'm trying to communicate? The frequent struggles of well-being, frequent struggles of emotional regulation, overstimuli, chronic fatigue, the exhaustion, anxiety, sadness, confusion, mood swings, irritability, difficulty concentrating, withdrawn or disconnected or numb. A lot of the time, these trauma signs and symptoms, are getting diagnosed as ADHD, bipolar, depression, ADD, anxiety, and we're using a brain disease approach and medicalizing it. We prefer to give them a pill instead of working through their 4 directions of self, their relationships of self, heart, body, mind, and spirit, to truly understand what is the story here and how can this story inform me as your helper, what evokes a strong human response and brighten your light within yourself. It's amazing once you tell a youth that you don't have ADHD, you're in a constant of unresolved trauma and grief that you may not understand until we start talking, until we start, you get to encourage the youth to learn their 4 directions of self through story will inform you while they start understanding and they start learning what is stimulating them and why it does. And as they shift to learn how it's not their fault, it's not a label they need to carry, those signs and symptoms will reduce through different means of healing that is self-determined. Youth are the experts. They will come to know, or they will tell you if they do know already, what they need. They are the experts of their lives. That's going to be distinctive by region, right? Urban, rural, province to province, country to country, to truly know their lives. This will help us develop meaningful relationships, build the capacity within our agency and policy. If you think of how Trudeau released the youth policy reform for youth to live in thriving lives, to access basic human needs, well, we need to then develop an Indigenous youth policy. And what does that look like? Youth story and voices, and this is greatly back to our land. The youth have, and it was mentioned in the earlier presentation, sometimes our youth have not had the opportunity to work with the land, the tan hiding, and they naturally pick it up. We far too often think of blood memory and that intergenerational piece that our blood remembers that trauma. We also have to remember our blood remembers that wisdom, those teachings, our ancestral lines. That's why sometimes if you see, and I've sat in women's circles and you said to me, I've never beaded before. All of a sudden I look over and I go, oh, wow, she's like already like 5 steps ahead of me. And I go check on her and she's just got it down on her vamps. Like I couldn't even, just blew me out of water. But that's her listening. That's her rebuilding those relationships within her 4 directions and following it, right? Even some of our men on the trap line, they naturally just remembered how to clean a rabbit and how to get them out of the snare without breaking it. And it just blew my mind. That's our medicine. Seeing them take that lead and letting to follow their spirit, knowledge, and wisdom is remarkable. I want to share a story about my time. So I left Southern Ontario. I'm now back here in my homelands because I'm from Robinson Superior. But there was a time, for over a decade, I lived in Southern Ontario. And I used to do a lot of consulting work with Indigenous group homes or residencies or healing centers and outreach. I get invited back from time to time to kind of sit in and consult or say, this is where this project started, because sometimes I was able to help with proposals from early on. And it's now, okay, we got to revamp our program and services. Can you help because you were from the beginning? But I've been finding, and this is province-wide, that a lot of the time our helpers are getting not only burnt out, but they're getting annoyed. And they're getting annoyed because they'll, and this is one specific case, and I'm sitting here listening to the helpers and they're saying, well, I brought her to the sweat twice now. And while I'm in the car with her, she will not go in. So I'm wasting my time to drive out to the reserve from our urban setting. We have other youth that are vanishing, like going AWOL, they're deciding to flee from our programs and services. So we have our outreach on the floor, on the ground, trying to search for them. I'm getting texts about that. So I'd be more useful if I was back at our center instead of wasting my time driving out here. She's not going in. And I go, do you know why? Well, she just wants to waste my time. I'm like, does she really though? What's her story? What do you mean? What's her story? Who is she? Where does she come from? What's her mom's name? I don't know. Like, why does that even matter? We're talking about her going to a sweat and I'm wasting our resources. So I said, interesting. So I said, I want you to take her to a sweat 8 times before you really consider giving up. I come back, I think it was probably about a year later, and I sit with this helper. So how's it going? Well, I've taken her now to a sweat more than 8 times, and she's gone in once. And I went, what did you learn? I realized that I've been on my phone scrolling once I park in front of the lodge, just waiting for them to get out, leaving the car in idle. He's like, but once you told me to start really get to know her, what's her story? I started watching, like, when she would leave my car, how she would stand out front of the sweat lodge. Even though other elders and women would greet her, she would still just stand there. He's like, so I started realizing maybe I should start asking questions. Like, are you afraid to go in? Like, do you want me to go in with you? Or should we go to a different sweat site? And he said, slowly she started getting closer and closer, but So he said one day, he's like, I think it was like the 5th time, he's like, I kind of just said, like, what's going on? Like, I'm getting concerned. Like, we keep coming here. And she goes, the last time I was at a sweat was with my mom. And her mom passed away about 2 years before that. Meanwhile, before him learning that, he was speaking ill of her, getting annoyed. We don't know what the energy of conversation may have been when she probably felt that, right? I've been taught the sweat represents the womb. It's a lot of energy for her to face entering, right? That connection back to her mom. No wonder why it took so many tries, but she made it. And she then entered the mentoring program, and she's now a helper at that same center years later. It is coming to understand Indigenous trauma and how that really begins with you as a helper, and then the work with our youth, and then the organization. It starts very much at that individual level, and then it ripple effects into the larger umbrella of the organization. So when we say it begins with you, we have to reflect, how am I showing up? Am I letting my lie influence my practice? Just like how I let it influence my personal life. The work with Indigenous youth, we got to walk with them. We got to meet where they're at, validate their stories and their experiences, help them understand and connect those experiences to the system and history and structures and political sectors of our country. It's not their fault. And then the organization. Far too often, there's a lot of lateral violence happening. But we have to do that extension of kindness as well with our peers, our helpers we work with. They're an extension of community, not just for ourselves as helper in the field, but for those that we're helping as well. We got to carry that with pride and go revisit our teachings, our 7 grandfather teachings as well. So when we walk together to be trauma informed, as I mentioned, it starts with our relationships, right? This is just a reminder, we're coming back around. By exploring and learning the relationships of your 4 directions of being, your relations to the land, spirit, and space can enhance your interconnection to self and those that you help as a service provider. The foundation of decolonizing the common misunderstandings and misrepresentations of Indigenous youth and families. There's so much more than those signs and symptoms of unresolved trauma and grief. We got to encourage that sharing. Practices of care encourages the shift to understanding the intersectionalities. And that's just a fancy word, but it's really all those things that influence our lives based on our gender and like sexuality and our race. And then we move into combating those barriers and challenges with extended kindness practices that builds towards being Indigenous trauma informed. And I like using the extended kindness practices because it kind of goes against lateral violence. This works not just for your own personal life practice and professional, but it works organizational as well. What does it mean as an organization or agency, our relations within our 4 directions of what does our vision of our organization look like in the 4 directions, heart, body, mind, and spirit? And how does that ripple into the communities and people we help and serve and families? You will walk around the medicine wheel with this in so many different ways. I see the chat here. I want to say miigwech for listening. Many teaching laws are required. How many people listen to youth and children? That's a good question. Our youth are so wise. We live in an adult supremacist system. Yes, the older generations need to revisit those developmental stages to work through their trauma. We all do. All of us do. And learn to be kind to ourselves while we do it, not to hold that measuring stick, right? We can use where we need to do more work on ourselves. So when we think about trauma assessment checklists, I actually have just finished co-writing a piece and what that looks like, but how these trauma assessments, again, come back to being very individualistic, because what may evoke a stronger human response last year may still evoke something, but not as large. So when we think about trauma assessment checklists, we have to also remember a lot of mainstream risk and safety assessments or trauma assessments are done in a Western worldview of understanding trauma. When we think, and that's important when we think about Indigenous trauma, Indigenous trauma is not the same as trauma. Indigenous trauma is trauma that we have experienced based on our race, with the aim from our government and for genocide to kill us and our culture, right? That's not the same trauma that Western notions of understanding. Because when you look at Western notions of understanding trauma, they have it in acute and chronic and history, They have it all categorized. Again, back to that Western notion that linear, one objective, that one reality of understanding. No. Indigenous trauma is complex and overlapping, webbed together like this because of that intersectionality. And it comes back to our 4 relations of self to understand and learn. And so does Baskin, Linklater, tribal theory from Barbara Allen. Yeah, Blackstock talks about it as well. So it's those things that there's a lot of literature to read. So I like to condense it and put it together as a bundle toolkit for you guys.
Just wanted to say thank you for your presentation.
You bet, you guys. Again, it was an honor to be here with all of you. I'm excited to keep learning with all of you and moving forward in a good way for our babies that are coming and those babies that are watching us.